I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Study war no more. I ain't gonna study
Today,
war no more. I ain't gonna
the global mobilization for peace in Ukraine comes to Boston as it does to other cities around the world. Today, we participate in the international call for a ceasefire and negotiations issued by representatives of 32 countries in Vienna this past June. Our message is simple. Cluster bombs, depleted uranium munitions, long-range missiles, fighter jets will not lead to peace. They will only lead to more death, destruction, and environmental devastation. We need a mutual ceasefire and negotiations without preconditions to end this war and avoid potential catastrophe for the planet. As the danger of nuclear war increases by the day. We address that message to Russia. We address it to all the countries of NATO. And we address it to our President, to our Congress, and we address it to our media, along with our demand that you start providing accurate coverage of the reasons for this war and of the needs to stop it now. Friends, these are perilous days. We may, friends, have differing views on this war. But whatever our perspective on the war now, the present reality is clear. Every day, our country's involvement in the Ukraine war increases. Every day, the death and suffering in Ukraine mounts. Every day, the danger of terminal nuclear war hangs over our heads as one side or the other gains the upper hand. And every day, climate catastrophe rushes at us. Nothing more effectively prevents the international cooperation needed to stem the climate crisis than war between the countries that caused the crisis. As a result, the war goes on and fossil fuel emissions increase by leaps and bounds. The war is connected to saving this planet from climate catastrophe. So let us begin. Please welcome our first speaker, the Reverend Vernon Walker.
All right, Vernon!
Vernon is a champion for social justice. He was a staff person until recently at the Better Futures Project, running the project to help communities develop resiliency to the oncoming climate changes that we see before us. Vernon is now a candidate for Cambridge City Council. Vernon Walker.
Yes, sir. Good morning, good afternoon, brothers and sisters. It is wonderful to be standing in solidarity with so many of you on this important issue of calling for a peaceful resolution to a very chaotic crisis overseas. Russia's invasion into Ukraine has started an unjust war. It has been estimated that over 200,000 people have died, both on the Russian and Ukrainian side, since the beginning and the inception of this unjust war. It seems that we're heading towards a war ultimately between the U.S. and Russia, as U.S. intelligence and military personnel that have been heavily involved in directing the Ukrainians' military effort. Billions of U.S. money is what's helping keep the Ukrainian government afloat as the U.S. is sending more and more deadly weapons. We are demanding that our government, the U.S. government, support talks between Ukraine and Russia. This unjust war cannot end in a peaceful way, in a peaceful end, unless Russia and Ukrainian leaders dialogue and converse one with another. We are joining today, brothers and sisters. We are joining the thousands during this week of global mobilization, calling for an immediate ceasefire and peace negotiation to end this unjust war. Is that right? The path, my brothers and sisters, to peaceful resolution will not come through military might, but through negotiation and a firm understanding that we are all tied in the inescapable garment of mutuality. And what affects one directly affects us all indirectly, as Dr. Martin Luther King said. We are urging our governmental leaders in the U.S. to have the courage of their conviction and call for war no more. This direct catastrophic war has already had an impact, as we mentioned, on the Ukrainian and Russian folks, and as countless of thousands of citizens have already died, and over 14 million have already been displaced. The war impact has been multiplied outside of the Ukrainian borders as rising prices continuously go up for wheat, fertilizer, and fuel, which is creating a global hunger crisis and pitting more and more people in poverty. We, as believers of peace, stand here together, united, saying that we shall study war no more. When we choose the way of love and to love our fellow human beings just as Jesus loved, violence will cease. The use of fossil fuels will decrease. Programs designed for social uplift will be funded. Families torn apart by war will be united, and we will be on a path to help usher in the realization and the materialization of the beloved community. When we allow talks to happen between nations, then a truth peace can be brought to fruition. When we allow these talks to happen, then the U.S. we can focus our attention on the climate crisis and addressing a plethora of social issues that we have here in our nation. When we allow nations to talk one to another, we can avoid and avert the possibility of a nuclear war, which will leave us all decimated and affected in some way. Brothers and sisters, I know the path towards peace is not easy. I know the path for advocating for peace is not easy, but we are standing on the right side of history. We are standing in a space where we can help bend the arc towards the moral universe. It is long, but it bends towards justice, and it won't bend through osmosis. It'll bend when you and I continue to stand in solidarity, walk in solidarity, call our representatives, our senators, and our state and our U.S. representatives, and our local leaders, and our city councilors, and our state reps, and our state senators to tell them that stand up for peace, stand up for righteousness, stand up to call ceasefire, because ceasefire will not come through osmosis. What we need, our brothers and sisters, to help usher in peace is to let nations talk to each other. Let the Ukrainian and the Russian nations talk to each other. And if we don't allow them, and if there's not a willingness for them to talk, then this war will be perpetuated. It is important that we are able to push global peace so that a common ground can be found and that we can all work together. What the world needs is more love. And what we need is to realize that our humanity is bound up one to another. I heard the famous quote that I can't be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. So let us stand up for righteousness. Let us stand up for justice. Let us continue to join the thousands across the world who are mobilizing on peace. And we will continue to organize, to mobilize, to strategize until we study war no more. Thank you.
Well, Vernon, thank you so much. So let's follow those words. Our next speaker is Dr. Joseph Gerson. Joe Gerson is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. Joe started his work for justice and peace organizing against the war in Vietnam in Arizona, of all places, which at that time, of course, was represented by Senator Barry Goldwater. Joseph has not stopped. Today, Joseph travels around the world giving talks to various peace movements. He is our connection to the international peace movements, especially in Europe and in Asia. Please welcome Joe Gerson.
Thank you, Paul. And let's really appreciate that we've got a preacher on our side, right? Who's bringing with him, the history and traditions and values of black people across this country and of the civil rights movement. We are very, very fortunate. Just to say, I actually got my start in civil rights demonstrations and learned organizing with coal miners out of the mines in West Virginia. This morning, I was on an international webinar that kicked off the Week of Action with people from Ukraine, from across Europe and Asia. So, we're part of a larger movement here. This may not be the biggest rally in Boston's history, but adding our bodies and voices to the international call to end the Ukrainian war with the ceasefire and negotiations, and to help to build to stem the tide of more war, potentially much more dangerous war, is very, very important. A few days ago, I joined a German webinar with Alexei Gromyko, the grandson of the longtime Soviet foreign minister. He is a senior figure in the Russian establishment, and 2 points from his talk stood out for me. First, this is the most dangerous moment, he said, in world history since 1962. That's when the U.S. and the Soviet Union went eyeball to eyeball in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's when the Kennedy administration believed that the chances of an apocalyptic nuclear war were between a third and a half. It was also the occasion for a series of miscalculations. We were brought to the brink of annihilation when a mistaken nuclear launch order was sent to a U.S. base in Okinawa. And again, when a nuclear-armed submarine was attacked with depth charges against the orders of President Kennedy. And again, now, we are confronted by arrogant great power confrontations and the danger of nuclear annihilation. Dr. Gromyko's other point, which we don't need to love, but do need to respect, helps to explain the urgency of today's crisis. Victory in the Ukraine war is, he said, and I quote, a key national security interest of Russia, and that, quoting again, no nuclear power can accept losing a military conflict. The greatest danger we would face now would be if Kiev threatened Moscow's hold on Crimea, home to Moscow's Black Sea Fleet for 3 centuries. That danger is mitigated a little bit by the stalemate and by the if you will, the apparent failure of Kiev's counter offensive. But as one Russian general said in a Track 2 exchange, if Crimea is threatened, all bets are off. He said all bets are off in terms of Russian resort to its nuclear arsenal. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 violated the UN Charter, but it was consistent with Russian history, with the empire's perceived essential vital interest, and with popular support of the Russian identified majority there. 60 years ago, President Kennedy was right when he advised that while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which will bring an adversary to a choice of either humiliating retreat or nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course, he said, in the nuclear age would be evidence only of bankruptcy of our policy and of a collective death wish for the world. We need to understand it's that dangerous. Regardless of right or wrong, regardless of NATO's reckless expansion to Russia's borders, the EU's insistence on that Kiev sever its economic ties with Moscow in order to join the European Union, and regardless of Putin's brutal imperial invasion of Ukraine, the reality is that time is not on Ukraine's side. We can talk about that later. Even as Tom Friedman wrote in the New York Times in the earliest days of the war, whether we like it or not, it can only end with a dirty deal. Which brings us to June's International Peace Summit in Vienna and the urgent need for a ceasefire and negotiations. I was there. With more than 300 people from 32 countries, primarily from Europe, but also from the Global South, we were blessed with the courageous presence of Russian and Ukrainian peace advocates. We certainly had our differences, not least were those between the Italian labor and religious leaders who have organized the largest peace rallies to date and who played a major role in organizing the Vienna Peace Summit. They and others wanted to limit demands to a ceasefire and negotiations. On the other side was the Peace in Ukraine Coalition representative and others who initially insisted that the summit's call include condemnation of NATO imperialism and rejection of all arms transfers to Ukraine. There was easy unity in condemning Russia's invasion, and in friendly conversation fueled by the desperate appeal to stop the devastation from Ukrainian and other delegates, and by the need for movement unity, conference organized unified around our call: ceasefire, negotiations, and this week's International Days of Action. 2 poignant memories persist. First was the shock that pressure from the Ukrainian government on the Austrian labor union that hosted the summit led to the cancellation of the conference site just 2 days before we 300 people from 32 countries descended on Vienna. Kiev wanted to prevent the summit from happening, and that should tell us something about Ukraine's commitment to democracy. Second was an excellent speech by the former U.S. Colonel and diplomat Ann Wright. She cut through the rhetoric and the criticisms that ceasefire will leave Russian aggression in place. She reminded those assembled that it took more than 500 meetings to achieve the now 70-year-old Korean armistice. In that light, she stressed, we have the urgent need for negotiations to begin the progress toward a ceasefire now. Before the war began, my hope was that diplomacy would prevent and result in a neutral, non-NATO Ukraine whose sovereignty would be credibly guaranteed, perhaps by the United Nations. That possibility was discussed in Track 2 diplomatic sessions and is still my hope. I also believe that it is in Ukraine's interest to discard its 10-point so-called peace demands. Crimea will not be returned to Ukraine. We may not like it, but that's reality. This war is stalemated, and the sacrifice of thousands of Ukrainian warriors' lives to regain just a few villages is a fool's errand that risks vertical and geographic escalation of the war. The longer it goes on, the more dangerous it becomes. General Milley warned that neither side can win this war militarily. Now, with its infinitely smaller economic, military production economic and military production capacity, and its much smaller population, compounded by millions of its refugees now across Europe who will never return, and with its diminishing international support for a costly and endless war, it is in Ukraine's interest, as well as ours, to press our leaders to begin pressing for ceasefire and negotiations. The truth is that Zelensky does face threats to his rule and maybe even his life if he reduces his demands. This underscores the need for Biden to stop allowing the Ukrainian tail from wagging the American dog. Biden should give Zelensky cover by insisting on negotiations and a ceasefire now. Biden should be declaring that it's time for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, between Russia and NATO, and between the United States and Russia. Friends, this is not going to be easy, but it must be done, and we can help make it happen. The Minsk Accords and the still secret Istanbul text are dead letters. Pax Americana, as Fiona Hill said, is over. War's speed history, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has crystallized the post-Cold War emergence of a new multipolar disorder. It is in our interest, in Ukraine's and the world's, to press the United States to demand a ceasefire, to move to negotiations, and we desperately need to adjust our policies to the reality of the new multipolar world. Thank you, and struggle.
Thank you, Joe, for laying out right before us what's at stake here. We are very, very fortunate to have our next speaker with us today, who's on a very busy schedule, but she decided to come by and join us for this rally for peace in Ukraine. I want to introduce Representative Erika Uterhoven, who represents my city of Somerville. And just to say that we are very fortunate to have someone in the State House like Representative Uterhoven, because here is someone who deals not just with local issues, not just with national issues, but with international issues. And there aren't too many elected officials that fit into that category. Please welcome Erika and express our thanks for all she does for us. Erika.
Thank you all so much. Good afternoon. It's really just an honor to be here because, and it was important for me to be here because for me, this global movement for us to stand up and call for peace is one that is rooted in our love for all of humanity and all of the world that we want to believe and build. It is rooted in our love for Ukrainian people who are facing senseless violence, murder, systemic rape, all of the horrors of war and being the victims of an imperialistic strategy. We are also here for our love of the people of Russia who live under a autocratic regime that is run by their ruling class that oppresses their people through extreme inequality, extreme political suppression, and many of these wonderful, beautiful activists across the globe and in Russia notably face these incredible threats to violence in their own bodily humanity. We're also here for all of our love of all of the people who are impacted by the food crisis, the famine, the threats to all of our food systems that have been perpetuated by this war, and our love for any person in the countless environmental justice communities across the globe that are impacted by the threats of climate change and this ongoing war, as well as anyone who is a threat to the dangers of nuclear war breaking out, which is really all of us. And that is the shared humanity that we are here and we stand here for our love for all people today. And that means really it's something very personal to me because I'm a Japanese American. I grew up here in the US. My mother immigrated from Japan. And so my entire life I've had to navigate that hyphen between Japanese American, Asian American, and what a professor, who posthumously my teacher, from reading his works, Howard Zinn talks about how war poisons all. And I've seen that firsthand in my upbringing and my life, whether it's the racial discrimination and hatred towards Japanese Americans passed down generations of why we were the bad side that needed to be fought, as well as thinking about the generational trauma in my own family. My grandfather fought in the Imperial Army in Japan. He went to China and caused senseless violence, and then brought that home, and brought that into the household. So that's what we mean by the war poisons all, right? And I wanted to bring that because Professor Zinn brings about, the way he talks about peace and justice, and this movement is about his experience as a bombardier in World War II. And I think in many ways, each and every one of us have that personal story and connection to why this is so critical and why we understand why this is so important for our shared humanity. I also want to just state too that this means so much to me to stand here with you all as a young activist. I think of generational trauma, and I also think about generational movements. And I know many people I've had the opportunity to get to know and understand and why they got involved in mass peace action or peace movements across the globe. A lot of us have a shared experience, and particularly I want to honor people who first got politicized through the Vietnam War and got politicized through trying to stop it and saw firsthand the consequences for standing up for peace and the consequences for standing up against imperialism. And I share that because for myself, my first political moment or politicization in my life was the Iraq War. I was in high school at the time, and I remember I didn't have the language for it at the time. I was just a high school student, but it just didn't make sense. Like, why are we going to war in Iraq? And for most of my life, sadly, we have been at war as a country, right? Participating in all of these wars without pause. And so for me, I also just want to honor this sort of generational movement that I really deeply, I didn't know it at the time when I was in high school, but I very much stood on the shoulders of all of you who stood up against injustices in Vietnam and previous injustices of our the imperial acts of our government. And I just really want to honor that and thank that, because then I wouldn't be where I am today without each and every one of you. And that's why we continue this struggle and we stand here today. It was so important to be here and to be part of this global movement that is calling for peace and calling for justice and calling for, while it's never the easiest thing, but not succumbing ourselves to that poison and succumbing ourselves to the ugly underbelly of fight more with more. And what we know is going to result in that is the destruction of us all. And that is a real threat that people have had to reckon with and deal with and see the physical consequences of, that we refuse to participate in. So I just really want to thank you all so much for being part of this movement. It's truly an honor to stand here with you all and to call for diplomatic solutions, call for ceasefire. And we know that in our past, this is not a new idea. This is something that in previous difficult and precarious moments of our nation's history, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis or others, that it was ceasefire, it was negotiations that got us to a solution, not listening to the hawks. And that's what we're calling for today. And I want to say thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Erica, for those words and for spending your time with us today on this Saturday. I want to welcome our next speaker, Stephen Kinzer, who writes for the Boston Globe, if you can believe that. Stephen Kinzer is one of those few historians and journalists out there who remind us where we've come from and where we are at. He writes the stories behind the headlines, and he keeps us informed and keeps us on track. So please welcome Stephen Kinzer.
Thanks so much. It's great to be out here with you and feel like there's still some energy, and I feel like in a way things might be moving in our direction. Let me talk a little bit, just briefly today, first of all about how we got here, where we are now in the Ukraine war, and where we might be going. First of all, how did we get here? This is a war that was imposed. This war did not have to happen. There was no reason for this war. All the President of the United States had to do a couple of years ago was stand up and utter one sentence. Ukraine will not join NATO. That would have prevented this entire war. We are chewing through an entire generation of Ukrainian men in order to determine where is the border with Donbass. But for the Americans, it's about something more than that. We can hear U.S. senators cackling on the record about how wonderful this war is because so many Russians are dying and no Americans are dying, as if the Ukrainian lives are worth nothing. In 2015 and 2016, Western powers came together with Ukraine and Russia and signed what was known as the Minsk Accords. They made perfect sense. There was going to be a neutral, non-aligned Ukraine. There would be United Nations-sponsored referendums in disputed provinces. And this seemed to be a way out. So just about 6 months ago, somebody walked up to Angela Merkel, who was the German leader who signed that Minsk Accord, and said, "What happened to the Minsk Accord? Why didn't you comply?" And her answer was amazing, even to me, and I consider myself not so naive on these issues. She said, "We never intended to comply with it. It was just intended to give extra years so we could pour more weapons into Ukraine so the war would be bigger when it started." And then a reporter in France went to visit the person who was president of France at the time, Hollande, and asked him, "What did you think about what Merkel said?" And he said, "It's all true. We agreed. Let's sign this agreement, but we'll never comply with it." So even I was taken in by that one, and I can excuse for Putin for having been taken in as well. So this is a war that was brought about largely by America's innate, profound, deep need for enemies. We're always in search of enemies, and now we've got some great ones. We love to build them up and make it seem like the whole world is surrounding poor little United States, and we're always the victims. We only have to go out and defend ourselves. So this is a war that is going on mainly to satisfy the lust of people in the West, and particularly in Washington, to bleed Russia. It doesn't have anything to do with Ukraine. I can assure you that the people who are promoting this war in Washington barely can find Ukraine on a map. Ukraine doesn't interest them at all. They're just a pawn in a larger geopolitical struggle. Let me tell you, I lived in Nicaragua all during the 1980s as the New York Times correspondent there. And I watched something just like this. Nicaraguan kids killing other Nicaraguan kids in order to play out a global conflict. The people that are fomenting the conflict are not suffering. It's the kids on the ground who are dying, and their families that will never again be intact. So, where are we now after we've allowed this war to explode. In Washington, the mantra of as long as it takes is still very powerful. Nonetheless, I don't think that's so true out in the general population. You know, I feel like I've watched this movie before. I watched this movie in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It always starts the same way. We are told that the entire future of human freedom on Earth hangs on victory in this war. So we get very excited, we pour a lot of money in, then people start dying in huge numbers. We begin to realize that our ally is not the golden ideal that we thought. It drags on, and then people begin to wonder in the United States, why are we pouring our treasure into foreign treasuries, given all the needs that we have at home? And I think we're seeing that here in America. The last CNN poll showed that 55% of Americans oppose the provision of more weaponry to Ukraine. Now that change of opinion has not happened inside the Washington Beltway. The population is changing its mind on this issue, as well it should. Now I want to talk about two institutions that I think have failed us, and that will bring us to the question of where we're going in the future. One is an institution that I sort of represent, and the other is an institution that you sort of represent. That is the press and the progressive anti-war movement. I think both have performed poorly. The press is in a shameful state. Only opinions and articles on one side of this issue can appear in your newspapers. No dissent in any serious way is possible in the mainstream media, and there's hardly any exception to this. I feel like I'm living in the Soviet Union when I'm reading the entire monochromatic coverage day to day about the unprovoked invasion and the brutality of the invader and the innocence of the victim. But the progressive anti-war left has also not spoken up enough on this issue. There are too many people who like to say, well, it's imperialism on the other side, and we've always been anti-imperialist. But the key here is not for us to come up with the ultimate solution to the war. The key is to end the fighting at this moment and then begin negotiations and diplomacy. That's what diplomats are for. Now, I started out by talking about Russia's motivations. And I asked my friends this question: how would we feel if Russia or China opened a military base in Tijuana and placed nuclear weapons there? This is what Russia is facing. NATO wants to build a base right on Russia's border armed with nuclear weapons. Would we say in America, well, Mexico's an independent country, even though the nuclear weapons aimed at our cities are only a few miles away from our border, we're not going to do anything? We wouldn't do that. We can't tolerate that kind of a threat on our border. So place yourself in the shoes of people on the other side and try to answer that question of how you would feel if the shoe were on the other foot. And then I ask one other question. And that question is, what is so awful about a non-aligned Ukraine? Ukraine is perfectly placed to be the bridge between East and West, rather than a piece of territory that the East and West fight over until every Ukrainian is dead. So there's actually a model for this. I want to take you back to a little historical episode, and I'll finish with this lesson. After the end of the Second World War, occupying troops did not leave Austria. Austria was occupied for 10 years after the end of the war because both sides wanted it inside their sphere of influence. That dilemma was finally solved with something called the Austrian State Treaty. Austria agreed never to join a military alliance, never to have foreign troops on its soil, and to incorporate these promises into its constitution. Austria has done great since then. It doesn't threaten anyone, and it's not threatened by anyone. This should be our model for Ukraine. I feel that the job for you, people who are active in the anti-war movement, has to be to try to educate your comrades in all of these domestic social justice movements that have sprung up over the last decade and are doing such powerful work. I admire what they're doing, but I always see a big hole in their argument. And that is, they don't make the connection between our failure to serve our own people at home and the massive amounts of money we are spending on wars abroad. What we need to do is to understand that there's an answer to that question, where are you going to get the money for that? That's what you always hear. We want Medicaid for all. Who's going to pay for it? We want free community colleges for everybody. Where are we going to get the money? Yeah, I have the money. I have $800 billion in the Pentagon. I want people working on social justice movements to make this connection so that our movement to try to end the carnage in Ukraine is understood as not simply a foreign policy project, but it's also a project aimed at turning the United States into the model that we all want it to be. It wasn't very far from this spot in 1630 when John Winthrop got up and said we wanted to be as a city upon a hill. Let us devote our efforts to transforming our society so we truly are a city upon a hill and not build bombs made to destroy hills in other countries. Thank you.
Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Thank you.
Well, I would say there's someone who's not going to study war no more.